Hi everyone. Just a little disclaimer before getting to this one. And this is not speaking to the converted. Most people who comment on my channel are decent people, um, and most of my subscribers are decent people. But sometimes, however, I've had an experience where people will jump to conclusions about what my opinions are when they clearly haven't watched the video. So all I would say is, if you're going to do that, you know, just just know that you'll be the one looking like a fool. I won't censor your comment, but I've had that before. The video I made about Tommy Robinson and the restaurant, even though I was somewhat critical of the way the restaurant handled that, because I dared to say that I wasn't a fan of Tommy Robinson, his fanboys and fangirls immediately pounced on me because these people lack any objectivity whatsoever. Even when someone is actually being fair and balanced and not just attacking Robinson, they still get their little radar. It's like, oh, he's attacking our Tommy. I mean, it's pathetic. Um, this sort of knee jerk reaction that some people have. So if you're not going to watch my video, feel free to look like a fool. Feel free to spout out whatever interpretation you want. Now, I'm not talking about people who watch the video and still disagree with me. That's your right to disagree with me. But I'm just saying, at least watch the video. At least, be fair. Watch the video if you disagree with me, fine. But don't not watch the video and then spout out a lot of nonsense because you're going to look like a fool. Um, that having been said, what I want to talk about is the term far right and how it's utilized in this country. I think it's one of those terms, it's obviously two words, that is thrown around a bit, and frankly, by both left and right. A bit like woke. It's become a political football in vernacular in recent years. So, just to put my cards on the table, be very clear where I stand with this from the outset. I do think the term is overused. I do think sometimes it's applied inaccurately and wrongly. And I think it's incredibly lazy to say that anyone who's concerned about immigration is somehow far right. Okay, so I do think it is overused. But I also think there are people out there who are in denial that there is a problem with the far right, who are in denial that there is extremism in our midst. Of course, there's Islamist extremism. 20 years on from 7/7, that's still a serious problem. But yes, there is far right extremism in this country. And it's almost like a right wing political correctness that they don't want to talk about it. At the very mention of far right, they get into this hysterical thing about don't brand us far right. Well, actually, if you're not supporting the far right, I won't brand you as far right. Okay, but I think both left and right kind of play this football with this term. The left overuse it, but the right, frankly, underplay it. They too often they make excuses for it, or they just pretend it doesn't exist. There's some very toxic groups out there, like Patriotic Alternative, National Action, the EDL, Britain First. They're probably defunct now. I believe they are actually, but these groups always take on different incantations. They'll just change their name. So I don't think the far right ever really disappears. Just like the Islamist groups do. I mean, whenever an Islamist group is prescribed, they just change their name, and that's one of the problems with extremism generally. It's like a snake. It's hard to control. Um, so let's just look at an example of this. The protests recently that have been going on in hotels in the home counties, particularly in Essex. I know there's been some trouble in Epping. Um, GB News had their journalist Charlie Peters at the scene of the latest protest, and his whole report was about, I haven't seen any far right, this is just concerned citizens. Now, I'm not there, he might well be telling the truth. Um, but honestly, I don't trust GB News on this issue. I don't trust them. I remember last year, excuse me, just checking the text. Last year, when the violent unrest was going on, GB News basically they didn't support the violence, but they did say, I saw their pundits coming out with things like this is just fed up citizens. So they didn't explicitly support the violence, but they were essentially making excuses for it. Someone who wears a balaclava and torches a car, any car, um, who threatens to burn people alive in a building, is a criminal, is an extremist. Okay, I don't care if they're male, female, young, old. If they behave that way, they deserve no respect. Um, an innocent woman in my city, British woman, she parked her car in Sunderland city centre and it was burned during the riots here. This was a woman who just went to go shopping. Um, so anyone who thinks that that's a legitimate expression of frustration, it really makes me angry when people attempt to defend this stuff through frustration. I feel immensely frustrated about many things, but guess what? I don't go and burn someone's car. So I'm sick and tired of people making excuses for violent protesters. Um, I'm reluctant to call them protesters. It's like the left went out of the way to make excuses for the obnoxious antics of just stop oil, but the right are kind of doing the same thing by making excuses for violent rioters against immigration. I mean, we know what happened last year after that awful crime in Southport. It spread like wildfire through disinformation. And, you know, instead of just doing the decent thing and condemning it, GB News, Nigel Farage and co, they immediately said, oh, it's the fault of immigration. We don't support the violence, but it's the fault of immigration. So they're trying to take away responsibility from violent rioting thugs. And I've got a big problem with that. If you cannot bring yourself to just condemn it, then you've got a problem. Now, regarding Epping, there's been apparently police accompanying counter protesters, that is to say, people in favour of the migrants. And even that was getting controversy. Why should they protect them and so on? Well, or why should the police be there? Clearly, I have no problem with that. I mean, why? What's wrong with taking precautions? I think people should be allowed to peacefully protest either way, either against migrants or for migrants. But I've no problem with a police presence. The fact of the matter is, there has been violence. There was violence in Ballymena. There was trouble last week in Epping, not quite on the scale of Ballymena, but bad enough. Um, and there was violence across England last year. So, really, to blame the police for simply having a presence, I think is ridiculous. I will also say, if you're covering your face, um, what are you hiding? Whether you're, trying to push some left wing ideology or right wing ideology, whatever your cause is, if you're covering your face, I think you're going, as far as I'm concerned, you're looking for trouble. Uh, you know, if it's for the rain, then bring an umbrella. I do not trust anyone that covers their face in protests in this country. Um, so yeah, I just think that I mean, there's times when left wing politicians have come out with some incredibly stupid things. There was a Labour minister recently who tried to say that it's not true that it's young men coming over in the boats. That's clearly just not accurate because it is largely young men. So for him to suggest that was just disingenuous, and the problem with that is the public see the disingenuousness. Um, and I also think that the way the Labour government has handled the grooming gangs thing, Starmer's office said it's, the far right pushing this. Well, there may be far right influence, but the calls for an inquiry into grooming gangs is hardly a far right idea. It was a reasonable demand for what was one of the worst crimes this country has seen. So I do think sometimes left wing politicians do themselves no favours. But the danger with all of this is that it's a bit like when the term racism is overused. If it's misapplied, then the risk is it loses all meaning. So I do believe that the far right exists and I do believe that they're a problem. But when you misattribute it, then it loses its weight. And it means that when there actually is a far right presence, it won't actually get the scrutiny that it deserves because the term's been misused. So, you know, families protesting in Essex are not far right. but that doesn't mean that there's absolutely zero far right influence whatsoever. Apparently, Robinson's been planning some sort of protest down there. So I think it's incredibly naive to think, oh, it's absolutely 100% just frustrated citizens. No, I don't believe that. I think many of them will be, but there's this kind of reactionary defensiveness of I'm not far right, I'm not far right, and I get that because if you're not far right, you've every right to defend yourself. But it's honestly, I think both left and right play games with this. Like I say, the left throw around the term too much, but the right are guilty of denying it, pretending that it doesn't exist at all. Um, and when we talk about actual hardcore members of the likes of Patriotic Alternative, they probably number a few hundred. So they probably are extremely small, but that doesn't mitigate the influence that they can have, for example, on social media or elsewhere, through spreading disinformation. Someone doesn't necessarily have to be a paid up active member of those groups for them to have a negative influence. I'm going to show you a cartoon in the Times, which I think is quite poignant. Bear with me a second. Give me a few seconds to think about this one, but I think it's interesting. So it kind of directly confronts this argument that they're just families, and the image does indeed show just normal people. So have a close look at this. That's today's cartoon in the Times by can't quite see the artist there. Shrank. Okay, I think that's a pseudonym. But anyway, what we see in that image is the people at the top looking like pretty much normal people. Deport foreign criminals. We're not far right. We're worried about our kids, make keeping safe again, etc. Okay, so normal people. But then it shows a skinhead thug beneath that, typical sort of archetypal National Front type. To me, what this is saying is no, the protesters aren't far right, but the far right bubbles beneath the surface. And I think that's accurate. I think it does. Um, and I think there's decent people who need to be careful that they don't allow their frustrations to be exploited by far right groups. Of course, it's up to the government to respond to those frustrations. The issue of migrants in hotels, it's clearly a powder keg issue. People do feel when they face pressures in their own life, there's a cost of living crisis. There are, frankly, foreign migrants committing crime. Um, when there's those sort of problems and they see migrants into hotels, it will obviously increase anger. So I think that model needs to be seriously looked at. But I'll say again, and I make no apology for saying this, I think sometimes the immigration debate is far, far, far too negative. I think there's too much negativity around it because some immigration is absolutely good and can help the country. And this isn't even about just illegal immigration. Is I think there's people out there who just want a 100% halt on all immigration. I think that's extreme. I think it's unworkable. I mean, you're going to have a situation where people who have British citizens who might, for example, be married to someone from another country, you want to split up families. You want to create that sort of situation where, someone who may have a spouse or a partner in another country, they're suddenly not allowed to uh, have love because of that. I mean, I have a big, big problem with anyone whose attitude is let's just stop all immigration. I think it's unworkable anyway, but we need to control immigration and we need to deport foreign criminals. But really, I think the debate in general is just too negative. Um, but I'll wrap this up. I already know that there'll be some reactionary idiots because I've even used the term far right. They will think that I'm saying that I'm saying everyone who protests against immigration is far right. I'm explicitly saying that's not the case. Okay, so get your little brains thinking and not be so reactionary. I'm saying very straight, very clear. No, not everyone who protests is far right. Not everyone who has concerns about immigration is far right. People have a right to protest. People have a right to have concerns. But if you engage in violence, if you wear a mask, if you call for people to be burned alive inside a building, don't tell me that you're just a concerned citizen. And if you make excuses for those people, it's just as bad. You don't need to be personally involved in rioting to condone extremism. So there's people who themselves wouldn't set fire to cars or throw Molotov cocktails at the police or whatever, but they will make excuses for those who are. As far as I'm concerned, making excuses is almost as bad as doing it, because it's enabling that. Um, so yeah, probably this video will polarize people. If some idiot wants to misinterpret what I'm saying, that's their problem. If you want to disagree with me, any angle I've taken, fine. But just bear in mind, I've tried to be objective here. I've tried to say, look, you can't brand everyone who has concerns about immigration as extremist or far right. But to say that there is no far right influence whatsoever is false. Now, Charlie Peters of GB News, I don't know if he's telling the truth or not. He says he never saw any racist or far right influence there. Maybe he didn't, maybe it wasn't there. But he works for GB News. GB News has an agenda. GB News is an explicitly anti migrant channel. And frankly, I think GB News is full of wannabe Tucker Carlsons. Um, I don't trust GB News to be objective and balanced on this issue. I think they have an agenda. All migrants are bad, all migration is bad, anyone who protests against it is good. They have an agenda. And how anyone could claim that they don't is ridiculous. GB News is an incredibly opinionated channel with an agenda. And you might argue that it's a legitimate opinion, it's a legitimate stance, but do not tell me that GB News is balanced. It's one of the least balanced, least objective networks out there. Um, and when people are looking at that as a source, then the same with the likes of the Daily Express and so on. Although I have to say this, it is the Daily Express that featured that appalling image of a starving child in Gaza. So credit where credit's due. They did cover that, so fair play to them. Um, but in the end of the day, I don't think that being frustrated gives anyone a right to break the law, and some people will make excuses for that. Being fed up is not an excuse to engage in criminality. As for the police presence in Epping and elsewhere, you know, surely it's legitimate for the police to have a presence when there has been trouble at other events. I mean, do people really think it should just be a case we have two groups of protesters, those in favour and those against, and it should just be a free for all? They should just yell at each other, and then potentially there will be violence. There's very strong opinions on this subject. Both sides could potentially resort to violence. Another thing I'll say, just because people are, they have a family, doesn't mean they're not capable of doing bad things. Just because someone's a family man or a mother doesn't mean that they're totally innocent. I mean, some of those convicted of the violence last year were young mothers. So this idea that, oh, it's just families that therefore they must be good, they must be totally, they could be, but I don't think that automatically qualifies someone as not being a troublemaker. Why? Just because our general image of a troublemaker is a young man, and it usually is. But like I say, there were young mothers arrested in the violence last year. There was one so-called mother that threw a concrete slab at the police literally while she was holding a pram. So just because someone has a family doesn't mean that they're automatically innocent or not capable of extremism. Anyway, I'll wrap this up. That's my take. I think the term far right is thrown around too much, but unlike some people, I don't think it's non existent, and I do think it is a problem. And I do think there's some toxic forces out there who will absolutely incite violence.